The chains were cold against John Carter's wrists, a stark contrast to the stale, humid air of the transport ship's cargo hold. The Galactic Empire slavers had been thorough, metal restraints secured his ankles, and a thick collar hummed with the faint energy of a shock function. They thought he was broken, another nameless prisoner in their endless cycle of subjugation. They had no idea who he was. John kept his head down, his breathing steady, watching through half-lidded eyes as the guards moved through the rows of captives. Most were aliens, their varied features twisted in fear or resignation. A few humans huddled in the corner, whispering among themselves. They were younger, leaner, their bodies not yet worn by hardship. They didn't look at him, assuming, like the slavers had, that he was just an old man past his prime. A tall, insectoid guard stomped past, its exoskeleton clicking with each step. It prodded a cowering prisoner with the butt of a rifle, grunting something in its garbled language. The captive whimpered but complied, shifting into a line forming near the ramp. Processing. That's what the slavers called it. Stripping prisoners of names, identities, any trace of who they were before. John flexed his fingers, testing the restraints. Weak links. The slavers prioritized numbers over security, cheap iron cuffs instead of proper reinforced alloys. That meant they didn't see their slaves as threats. That was their first mistake. A sharp hiss filled the air as the ship's loading ramp extended, revealing a sprawling penal camp beneath a blood-red sky. Towers loomed in the distance, each crowned with plasma turrets. Fences crackled with containment fields, and the scent of burnt ozone clung to the air. Beyond the perimeter, skeletal mountains stretched toward the sky, barren and lifeless. There would be no easy escape. A voice, guttural and laced with contempt, echoed through the hold. "Move, meat." John looked up just as a heavy baton slammed against his ribs. He grunted, staggering forward, and the guard, a hulking reptilian with scarred scales, grinned. "Not so tough now, are you, old man?" John said nothing. He allowed himself to stumble, moving with the momentum instead of fighting it. The guard laughed and turned his attention elsewhere, already bored. Another mistake. The line of captives shuffled down the ramp, boots dragging against rust-colored dirt. John cataloged everything, the number of guards, the layout of the camp, the patterns in security. He had done this before, a lifetime ago, on planets that no longer existed. Back then, he had been younger, faster. Now his hair was white, his face lined with the weight of years. But war had never truly left him. The prisoners were herded through a processing station where an administrator, a wiry alien with an elongated skull, scanned them one by one. John stepped forward when commanded, his steel-gray eyes locking onto the administrators. The alien hesitated, its bony fingers twitching over the control panel. "This one is old," it murmured in its native tongue. "Unfit for labor." The reptilian slaver from before snorted. "He'll last long enough, or he'll entertain the guards." The administrator shrugged and pressed a button. John's collar beeped, registering him as property of the Empire. A number flashed across a nearby screen. He was no longer John Carter, just another slave. They were marched to the barracks. Long metal buildings with reinforced doors and small, grated windows. Inside, the air was thick with unwashed bodies and stale food. Bunks lined the walls, each occupied by a prisoner who barely spared them a glance. John sat on an empty cot, rolling his shoulders to test their range. His ribs ached where the baton had struck, but the pain was manageable. Across from him, a hulking alien with dark, leathery skin observed him through narrowed eyes. "You won't last," the alien muttered. John met his gaze. "We'll see." The alien snorted but said nothing more. Others were watching now, silent glances, wary stares. John was new, and new meant weak. The slavers had stripped them of everything except the will to survive. That, more than anything, was what John needed to change. Night fell, though the sky outside remained the same dull shade of red. The barracks were quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of feet. John lay still, listening. The guards passed by in rotations every 7 minutes, based on the timing of their footsteps. The fences pulsed at irregular intervals, meaning the energy field had fluctuations. The towers had overlapping fields of fire, but there were blind spots. Information, that was the key. A scream broke the silence. John sat up, his eyes locking onto the source. A prisoner dragged from his bunk by two slavers. The reptilian from before loomed over him, baton in hand. "You stole rations." The prisoner, a wiry humanoid with trembling hands, shook his head. "I didn't." The baton struck. The sound of impact echoed through the barracks. Again, until the prisoner stopped moving. The reptilian turned, scanning the room. "Let this be a lesson," he growled. "Step out of line, and you'll wish for death." The guards left, dragging the broken body with them. The silence that followed was heavy. John exhaled slowly. Fear. That was the real weapon the slavers wielded. Fear kept prisoners obedient, kept them from seeing the truth, that their captors weren't invincible, that the chains could break. He looked around the barracks, at the hunched figures, the averted eyes. He would need allies. But first, he needed to remind them of something they had forgotten. Hope. Morning came, and with it labor assignments. Prisoners were split into groups, some sent to the mines, others to the shipyards. John was assigned to construction, reinforcing the outer perimeter. Fitting irony. The work was brutal, the sun relentless. Guards patrolled lazily, confident in their superiority. The prisoners moved without words, heads down, muscles burning from exertion. John worked alongside the same alien who had spoken to him the night before. The creature lifted heavy beams with ease but moved without purpose. "What's your name?" John asked. The alien grunted. "Names don't matter here." "They will," John said. The alien hesitated. A moment later it sighed. "Derek." John nodded. "Derek. How many guards on the outer wall?" Derek frowned. "Why does it matter?" "Because numbers matter," John said simply. "So do blind spots, weak links in fences, rotation schedules." Derek's eyes narrowed. "You're planning something." John lifted a metal beam, adjusting its weight. "I'm just observing." Derek studied him for a long moment before returning to work. But the seed had been planted. Others had overheard. Curiosity had been sparked. By the time the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, John had mapped half the camp in his head. He had memorized faces, recognized who held influence among the prisoners. He had begun laying the foundation. As the barracks doors locked for the night, John leaned back against his cot, closing his eyes. The slavers had made a mistake. They had enslaved a Special Forces veteran, and soon they would regret it. The storm rolled in without warning. Thick, ash-colored clouds churned overhead, and a biting wind howled through the camp. The scent of charged ozone filled the air as distant thunder rumbled across the jagged mountains. It was the kind of storm that sent prisoners scurrying into their barracks, the kind that made slavers retreat into their fortified towers. For John Carter, it was an opportunity. He stood near the perimeter wall, hauling a rusted support beam into place with Derek and two others. The wind whipped sand against his skin, stinging like needles, but he barely noticed. His attention was on the guards, their movements, their shifting postures. The storm had rattled them. They were distracted. That was all he needed. Derek adjusted his grip, lifting the beam with practiced ease. "It's tonight, isn't it?" John gave a slight nod. No words, no unnecessary risks. Everything had been planned, every detail accounted for. He had spent weeks gathering intel, testing weaknesses, building trust. Now it came down to execution. A guard marched past, his rifle slung lazily over one shoulder. He glanced at John but didn't linger. Good. The slavers still saw him as an old, broken man, unworthy of concern. That illusion wouldn't last much longer. By the time night fell, the storm had grown into a full-blown tempest. Rain lashed against the barracks, and lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the camp in jagged bursts of light. The guards had taken shelter, leaving only a skeleton crew to patrol the perimeter. John sat on his bunk, hands resting on his knees. Around him, the others waited. Derek stood near the door, his massive frame tense with anticipation. To his left, a wiry, four-armed alien named Tressa ran a final check on the stolen plasma torch hidden beneath her cot. Across the room, a silent, feline-like prisoner known only as Keth sharpened a piece of scrap metal into something lethal. John exhaled slowly. "We move on my mark." No one questioned him. They had learned to trust his judgment, to follow his lead without hesitation. Fear had once ruled this place, but not anymore. Not tonight. The first move came swiftly. The outer fence crackled as Tressa shorted the energy field using a repurposed control node. The lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, John struck. He moved faster than anyone expected, slamming his elbow into the nearest guard's throat before wrenching his rifle free. A single, silenced shot took down the next slaver before he could react. Derek barreled into a third, lifting the unfortunate guard off his feet and driving him into the mud. Keth moved like a shadow, slashing through exposed throats with terrifying precision. By the time the lights stabilized, the sentries were dead, their weapons now in the hands of their former prisoners. John pressed a finger to his ear, activating the stolen comm unit. Phase 1 complete. Move. Across the camp, chaos erupted. Explosions rattled the air as sabotage teams hit supply depots and barracks, cutting off the slavers' ability to regroup. The prisoners, once shackled and broken, now fought with a desperate, vicious fury. John led the charge toward the central command post, rifle steady, each shot precise. A slaver lunged from the shadows, blade in hand, but John sidestepped with practiced ease, twisting the attacker's arm until bones snapped. The guard crumpled with a scream. John didn't stop moving. Derek tore through the remaining resistance, his sheer size making him an unstoppable force. Tressa worked on overriding the security protocols, fingers dancing across the stolen access pad. "Almost there," she muttered. John covered her, dropping 2 more slavers with well-placed shots. His movements were instinctive, honed by decades of war. He felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. A sudden roar split the air. The main gates burst open, and a squad of heavily armed enforcers stormed into the camp. They weren't the usual slaver thugs. These were elite soldiers, clad in reinforced armor, weapons primed and ready. John cursed under his breath. The Empire had responded faster than expected. "Fall back," he ordered. Derek dragged Tressa behind cover while Keth disappeared into the darkness. The enforcers opened fire, plasma rounds searing through the rain. John ducked, returning fire with practiced precision. One enforcer dropped, then another, but they kept coming. Tressa's voice crackled through the calm. "They're calling in air support." John's mind raced. They couldn't win a prolonged fight. They needed to shift the battlefield. "The shipyard," he said. "We take a transport and get the hell out." Derek nodded. "Then let's move." The group broke into a sprint, weaving through the burning wreckage of the camp. Prisoners clashed with slavers in brutal skirmishes, makeshift weapons against imperial steel. John ignored the chaos, eyes locked on their target. The docking bay where the slavers kept their ships. An explosion rocked the ground behind them. John glanced back in time to see the barracks collapse in a fireball of twisted metal. More enforcers poured in, cutting down prisoners with ruthless efficiency. He clenched his jaw and kept running. He couldn't save everyone. Not yet. The shipyard was within reach when the ground trembled beneath them. A low, mechanical hum filled the air as a massive gunship descended from the storm clouds, its cannons glowing with energy. John skidded to a halt. "Cover!" The first blast struck the ground mere feet away, sending debris flying. Derek shielded Tressa with his body, while Keth darted behind a supply crate. John hit the dirt, rolling as another explosion shook the earth. This was bad. They needed an opening, something, anything. Tressa's voice was sharp. "I can hack the ship systems, but I need time." John didn't hesitate. He rose from cover, rifle aimed, and squeezed the trigger. A single shot found its mark, striking a weak joint in the gunship's armor. The vessel shuddered, momentarily thrown off balance. Derek seized the opportunity. With an earth-shaking roar, he charged, hurling a stolen grenade into the ship's exposed vent. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was enough. The gunship veered off course, smoke billowing from its side. Tressa sprinted to the nearest transport, fingers flying over the controls. Almost there. John and Derek held the line, keeping the enforcers at bay as Keth silently eliminated stragglers. The ship's engines roared to life, blue light spilling from its thrusters. Tressa grinned. "We're in." John wasted no time. "Move!" They piled into the ship, slamming the hatch shut just as the enforcers regrouped. Plasma fire rattled against the hull, but it was too late. The ship lifted off, breaking through the storm with a deafening roar. John exhaled, watching the camp shrink below them. The rebellion had begun, but the war was far from over. The stolen transport hurtled through the storm's upper edge, rain and static battering its hull. Inside the cockpit, Tressa's hands flew over the controls, her jaw clenched with concentration. Warning lights blinked in angry reds and yellows, but the ship held together barely. John stood behind her, eyes scanning the sensor readout. Imperial fighters would be in pursuit soon. They needed a destination, somewhere to regroup, to plan. Derek loomed near the rear hatch, weapon in hand, still tense from the battle. Keth was silent as always, crouched in the shadows, sharpening his stolen blade. Tressa cursed under her breath. "We're not out of this yet." Long-range scanners just picked up an Imperial cruiser. John's jaw tightened. Of course, the slavers wouldn't let them escape so easily. The Empire never left loose ends. He leaned over the console, analyzing the readout. The cruiser was positioned ahead, its massive silhouette barely visible against the swirling storm clouds. Fighters would launch soon, cutting off their exit. "We won't outrun them," Derek growled. "No," John agreed. "We go through them." Tressa turned, eyes wide. "That's suicide." John's gaze was steady. "Not if we hit them where it hurts." A beat of silence. Then Keth spoke, his voice a quiet rasp. "Target their hangar. Before the fighters launch." John nodded. "Exactly." Tressa exhaled sharply but adjusted their trajectory. The transport shuddered as she pushed the engines past safe limits, streaking toward the looming warship. Alarms wailed. Plasma fire erupted from the cruiser's turrets, lighting up the void in deadly arcs. John braced himself. "Derek, get ready. The second we breach, we take the fight to them." The reptilian bared his teeth. "Gladly." The moment stretched, electric with tension. Then, in a single pulse of motion, their stolen ship slammed into the hangar bay, tearing through its energy shielding in a cascade of fire and shattered metal. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time, John wasn't just surviving. He was fighting back.